You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Marshall with News Hour. Now, how would you like your death to be marked?
When I die, I'd like a line of bunny girls in black and a southern gospel choir singing Baby Got Back. I'd quite like Shane MacGowan to sing Spirit in the Sky, but please don't write me poems when I die.
That was the performance poet Sophie Blackwell with an extract from her work, Don't Write Me Poems When I Die. Well, if not as an epitaph, when are poems appropriate? Is poetry as an art form, not just alive, but relevant? We've seen protest poets come to the fore during the Arab Spring and the Occupy movements, but is poetry just a deliberately complicated way of saying nothing in particular? To discuss poetry's purpose, NewsHour's James Kumarasamy was joined by Sophie Blackwell, as well as the editor of the Scottish Review of Books, Alan Taylor, and the Iraqi Kurdish poet in exile, Dr. Choman Hadi. She began by making the case for poetry.
Poetry can do what journalism and history and politics cannot do, and that is it brings home the specifics of life experiences and the truths of our everyday lives. It makes it possible for us to relate to different experiences throughout the world. We can face it in a way without having to turn our faces because it's too tragic or because it's just sheer numbers and it doesn't mean anything. It's about the meaning, it's about the details, and it's about the truth.
What does it do that prose doesn't do?
You can read a poem on a train in a few minutes. It can tell you something very substantial, whereas I think with fiction it's much more time-consuming. And poetry, on the other hand, has rhythm, which some fiction does, of course, but generally it doesn't.
Sophie Blackwell, I mean, you perform poetry. I guess maybe you haven't performed on a train, but what is it about the type of poetry that you perform that you feel is valuable?
I would say that rhythm is absolutely a part of it. Whenever I'm composing performance poetry, it's usually based on something quite musical, like a riff or a line that has a particular beat to it and a particular movement forward. I think performance poetry does have links to the sort of poetry that was read out around fires and in banqueting halls or whatever in pre-literate societies, because a lot of the pieces you do are meant to be memorised.
OK, well, to Alan Taylor, you take a rather more sceptical view at times.
Well, yes, I mean, first of all, I'd say that good prose, of course, is rhythmical, lyrical, poetic. A favourite writer of mine, Muriel Spark, wrote novels as if they were poems and can be read as such. You could read a page of her novels and say, wow, because the whole thing flows and it has a structure and it's meant to have a kind of poetic bent. I can't really be against poetry. That would be ludicrous. It'd be like an Italian saying they're against pasta. I have a thing about poets. I don't like the way, in general, they read their poems. I don't like the way they introduce their poems, which tend to be longer than the poems themselves. And I kind of recoil at the sense that it's some kind of calling or vocation, as if they were nuns or monks or whatever, and that there was some kind of religious order they joined.
Let's let our poets come back at you, because, I mean, Sophia, for a start, you describe yourself as a burlesque almost. I don't think a nun is quite appropriate.
My stage presence is not very nun-like. I like to present myself in a more immediate and in-your-face kind of way. There is artifice in that as well. I'm not going to lie. It's not kind of like I'm being a truer version of myself. I'm doing an act, but I do completely understand your frustrations.
Alan, what do you think? I mean, does that sound like something that you would feel is more genuine poetry?
Not necessarily. This is a sort of performance, it's an act. And actually, I hate actors reading poems more than I hate poets reading poems.
I agree, yes.
And so
this kind of rather false voice, this crazy dramatisation that comes into the whole thing. The best readings of poems is by poets who read it in the plainest, simplest way, as long as they catch the rhythm of the sentences.
Let me come to you, Choman Hadi. Does that need to come from very personal experiences like yours?
Not at all. I mean, there are many poets who write about nature, write about stones, mountains, very neutral subjects, but I think people write out of different needs and interests. I personally think if a poet doesn't have rhythm, is not a poet, really. I must confess that I do also tell stories before I read my poems. And why do I do that? Because I think much of what I write needs a lot of contextualizing, and I am writing about my own national history and gender history and so on.
Yeah, let's ask Alan about that. Don't you think that there are some types, some genres that do need contextualising. For example, exactly what Choman is talking about, her poetry about an experience of the Kurdish experience. When she is reading it, it helps people understand the poetry.
But one would also hope that the understanding is within the poem itself. I've heard poets, for example, introduce haiku, and the introduction's gone on for half an hour, and the haiku's over before they could finish breathing. But, you know, others prefer other things. You know, some people prefer more performance, others
yeah, exactly.
prefer
We're getting into the performance versus the written word, aren't we? Do you question whether certain performances are poetry?
Well, certain performances, but, you know, this is a really rather old argument, to be honest. It was the argument against the Liverpool poets in the 1960s, that they were regarded as performance poets.
Roger McGough and people like that.
Yeah, and Brian Patton, Adrian Henry. I mean, they were great poets, and they were great readers of poetry. There were some people who came in their wake who weren't great poets and weren't great readers of poetry, but who felt that they could do this because these guys could do it.
Sophia, for you, words, performance, which do you spend more time honing?
The two kind of grow and are forged together. And if I write a poem, then I perform it, and I realise some bits of it aren't working, because you can actually get sort of feedback from how the audience react to certain things. Then I go on editing the piece, and so in a way the performance becomes part of the writing process. I do completely agree in terms of the Liverpool poets. They were the first kind of modern poets that I stumbled across at the age of about 12, and they completely blew the top of my head off.
Because what you do, it's closer to, some people say it's close to stand up,
yeah.
Or even rock music. I'm
or
thinking
rock
of people
music,
like John
pop,
Cooper Clarke or someone like
burlesque.
that.
Kind of like punk poets. I mean, you think reggae poets like Linton Kwesi Johnson, people like that. Some people come out of very kind of like conscious hip-hop, Public Enemy sort of tradition, and whereas some people come out of a more reggae-influenced tradition, and in some cases it's a more sort of emo, Morrissey sort of tradition, or people who think that, you know, musicians are poets, or at least some musicians are poets.
Choman Hardy, when you hear this, where does your poetry fit in with this sort of more rock music style of poetry?
Well, mine is definitely not rock music style, I must say. But I want to go back to what Sophia said at the beginning, and I think performance poetry is probably going back to the origins of poetry. Certainly in the Middle East, there was a, you know, oral culture, and poets would stand in a square reciting verses at each other, which they would produce on the spot. When I go to performance poetry readings, and I do, and I really enjoy them, but afterwards, if I see them on the page, sometimes they don't stand on their own like that. Sometimes I think maybe for performance poets, maybe it's best to produce two versions, one of them targeted at performing and the other one more for the page. I don't know, this is just an idea.
Alan, are you concerned about contemporary poetry and its lack of engagement?
Someone earlier mentioned sort of the neutral subjects of poetry. But what one would like to see is people writing, say, about the financial crash or something like that were turning their talents to that. It's not journalism, it's a different kind of take.
Sophia, what about you? Trees, rivers, or contemporary events?
I'd say that my poetry does address contemporary events and politics, but again, rather like Choman Hardy mentions, from a more kind of personal micro level, in terms of, you know, how are our day-to-day lives affected by these things, as opposed to the sort of vogue for I don't like the government style poetry.
Can poetry affect daily lives? Can it actually change things? I
think making a difference. I'd like to think so. I mean, that kind of goes back to those sort of romantic poets and the idea that it was this, you know, a great thing that was going to change the world. And I would like to think that poetry, you know, doesn't exist in a strange bubble.
That was performance poet Sophia Blackwell. We also heard from the editor of the Scottish Review of Books, Alan Taylor, and the Iraqi Kurdish poet in exile, Dr. Choman Hardy. That's it, though, from this edition of NewsHour. From me, Julian.